The sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden hue over the sprawling acres of the Harrison ranch. Clayton Harrison stood at the edge of the porch, his hands resting on the worn railing as he watched the evening sky fade into twilight. The wind, warm and dry, whispered across the fields, rustling the tall grasses that stretched endlessly toward the distant hills. His ranch, like the land he had inherited, was a testament to his hard work and tenacity. The walls of his house, though impressive in their grandeur, held the weight of years of labor, both physical and emotional. Clayton's mind was as hard as the weathered wood beneath his fingertips. A man of few words, he had earned a reputation for being both tough and fair. People respected him, and even feared him at times. His business dealings were always straightforward, his intentions clear. But in the quiet moments when no one was watching, Clayton often found himself questioning whether the life he'd built was truly fulfilling or just the result of relentless ambition. As the last of the day's light faded, his thoughts were interrupted by a familiar sound, the soft swish of a broom sweeping the front steps. Clara, his maid, was finishing her work for the day. She had been with him for years, efficient and dependable, moving like a shadow through the house, never asking for anything. A woman of few words herself, she had always been respectful but distant. Clayton didn't know much about her, other than that she came from a small town nearby and had never been one to ask for attention or pity. But tonight, something was different. Clara lingered longer than usual after finishing her chores. Clayton noticed her standing by the back gate, her hands folded in front of her, staring down at the dusty ground. There was a pause, an unusual stillness about her. She wasn't rushing to gather her things like she usually did. Instead, she took a deep breath, almost as if she was preparing herself for something. Clayton furrowed his brow. He'd grown accustomed to her quiet demeanor, but this was different. Then, as the evening grew darker, Clara did something Clayton hadn't seen her do in all the years she'd worked for him. She turned and walked away from the house, slipping through the back gate without so much as a glance in his direction. Her movements were deliberate, measured, as if she was trying not to draw attention to herself. Clayton's gaze lingered on her retreating figure as she disappeared into the growing shadows. For a moment, Clayton stood still, the silence of the evening pressing in on him. He knew he shouldn't care. Clara had always kept to herself, and he had always respected that. But something about her quiet departure gnawed at him. It wasn't like her to leave without a word, without a simple "good night, Mr. Harrison," as she always did. He felt an odd sense of unease settling in his chest. Why was she leaving at this hour? Where was she going? Curiosity tugged at him, and for the first time in years, Clayton found himself questioning the boundaries he had so carefully set around his life. He was a man who valued control, and yet, tonight, that control seemed to slip away like sand through his fingers. Without thinking too much about it, Clayton turned toward the barn, grabbed his worn hat, and slipped quietly down the back stairs. The night air was cool against his face, and the only sound was the soft crunch of gravel beneath his boots. He kept his distance, moving silently along the shadows of the barn and behind the large oak tree that lined the property's edge. There was no need to let Clara know he was following her. If she caught him, she'd surely ask questions, and he wasn't sure he had any answers to offer. His heart beat a little faster than usual as he watched her walk down the narrow path that led away from the ranch. Clara didn't seem to notice him, her steps steady, but there was something about the way she carried herself tonight that felt different. The calm, collected woman he had grown used to had vanished, replaced by someone who appeared almost fragile. Clayton's gaze remained fixed on her as she moved deeper into the night, the weight of uncertainty heavy in the air. For the first time, Clayton Harrison, the man who always knew what was going on around him, felt the sting of being left in the dark. Clara's footsteps echoed softly as she walked through the village, her pace quickening with each stride. The sun was dipping lower, casting long shadows across the dusty streets, but she paid no attention to the beauty of the fading day. Her mind was elsewhere, focused on something Clayton could only begin to guess at. From the cover of the trees at the edge of the market square, Clayton watched her carefully. His heart beat a little faster, a strange mix of anticipation and confusion tightening his chest. He had always kept his distance from Clara, never prying into her life, but tonight was different. Tonight, something about her movement, sure, hurried steps, the way she kept her gaze down had caught his attention in a way that made him feel uneasy. He followed her through the winding streets of the village, staying just far enough behind to keep from being noticed. Every time Clara glanced over her shoulder, Clayton instinctively ducked behind a fence or a cluster of barrels, trying to remain unseen. But his curiosity only grew the longer he trailed her, the mystery of where she was going, growing thicker with each passing minute. Clara moved through the village like a shadow, blending into the surroundings, never lingering in one place for too long. The vendors in the market called out to the passing townsfolk, but Clara didn't stop. She didn't look at them or even acknowledge their presence. Clayton watched as she moved past the stalls, her eyes focused straight ahead, her posture tense. She walked with purpose, as though she had somewhere important to be. But why wouldn't she stop to greet anyone? Was there someone in town she was avoiding? A thought flashed through Clayton's mind, one he couldn't quite shake. What could be so important that Clara, a woman who kept to herself, would go through such lengths to avoid others? She had always been a solitary figure, quiet and reserved, but there was always a certain steadiness to her. Now, though, Clayton saw something different. There was a sense of urgency in her every movement, and a subtle fear in the way she held her head down, avoiding any interaction. It wasn't like Clara to behave this way. As they reached the far end of the market, Clayton saw Clara take a sharp turn onto a narrow path leading away from the heart of the village. The street was less traveled here, the houses more spread out, the people fewer. Clayton hesitated for a moment, watching her disappear around the corner, the evening shadows swallowing her up. His heart raced, and he found himself taking a few steps forward before stopping himself. What was he doing? Why couldn't he just let her go? She was just his maid, after all. What was there to uncover? But the question hung in the air, unanswered, gnawing at him. His curiosity pushed him onward. He followed the path quietly, keeping a safe distance. Clara didn't glance back, her attention still fixed ahead. The further they walked, the more Clayton's sense of discomfort grew. This wasn't a route he recognized, and it was clear that Clara had a destination in mind and that didn't involve the usual sights of the village. The houses grew fewer, the road narrower. What could she possibly be heading toward in this part of town? Finally, Clara reached the end of the road. Clayton ducked behind a stack of hay bales, heart thudding in his chest. She stopped in front of a small, modest house, one that Clayton had never seen before. The place was run down, nothing like the homes of the villagers he was familiar with. A broken fence sagged at the edge of the property, and the roof of the house appeared weathered and in need of repair. Clayton squinted, watching from his hiding place. Clara didn't hesitate. She walked right up to the door, knocked once, and entered without a second glance around. Clayton's mind raced as he stared at the house. Something about the whole scene felt off. Why had Clara, who usually kept to herself, chosen to come here? The answer eluded him, but his gut told him this wasn't just another one of her late-night walks. There was more to this story, more than he could see from the outside. Clayton felt a mix of emotions: curiosity, disbelief, and something else. A prickling sensation at the back of his neck made him realize that the image he had of Clara, the image he had built in his mind over the years, was slipping away. What else had she kept hidden from him all this time? What part of her life had he never known? His chest tightened, the weight of his own curiosity pressing down on him with more force than he could ignore. He had to know. Clayton's heart skipped a beat as he watched Clara turn down a narrow, dimly lit street, one he'd never paid much attention to before. The houses along the road were nothing like the neat, whitewashed homes closer to the village center. These buildings were worn, their paint peeling in patches, with cracked windows and crooked doorframes. The scent of damp wood and rotting leaves hung heavy in the air. Clayton hesitated for a moment, taking in the unfamiliar sight. This wasn't the kind of place he'd ever expected to find Clara, nor anyone in his employ, for that matter. It was a part of the village he'd kept his distance from, an area where people with little money and even less hope lived. His curiosity gnawed at him like a slow-burning fire. What was she doing here? Why had she come to this place where the streets seemed to hold a kind of quiet desperation? Clayton's steps slowed as he followed her at a distance, careful not to let her see him. The further they walked, the more the village seemed to fall away. The hustle of the market, the chatter of the townspeople, everything faded into the background, leaving only the sound of Clara's footsteps ahead. She didn't look back. She moved with a quiet urgency, as if she were trying to reach a destination only she knew. The street grew narrower as they moved deeper into the forgotten part of town. The houses here were a mix of sagging roofs and peeling plaster, with weeds creeping through the cracks in the sidewalk. The dimming light made the place feel even more forsaken, like a memory no one wanted to hold on to. Clayton's chest tightened with unease. This was not the kind of place Clara should be. She had always been so composed, so reserved, so separate from this kind of life. Why had she chosen this hidden part of town? At the very end of the street, Clara stopped in front of a small house that looked even more decrepit than the others. It was a single-story dwelling, barely standing on its foundation, with a door that seemed to hang loosely on its hinges. The windows were dirty and boarded up in places. It was clear that this house had seen better days, and it seemed to be one of the few still occupied. Clara paused just for a moment before walking up to the door. She knocked once, and a shadow appeared in the window behind her, just before the door creaked open. Clayton felt a jolt of surprise. He had been expecting her to knock, but something about the way she entered the house, without hesitation, felt like a secret being revealed. The door didn't close completely behind her. It was left slightly ajar, just enough for Clayton to see inside. His instincts urged him to turn away, to respect her privacy, but the pull of curiosity was too strong. He couldn't help himself. Stepping closer, Clayton moved with quiet caution, inching toward the open door. He peered inside, his breath caught in his chest. The dim light from within barely illuminated the room, but he could make out two figures. Clara was sitting at a small wooden table, her hands clasped tightly together. Across from her, a man sat with his back to Clayton. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his hair a little too long, and his face rough with age and hardship. There was something familiar about him, something that unsettled Clayton further. The man's presence, the way Clara's posture seemed to shift when he spoke, made Clayton's pulse race. What struck him the most, though, wasn't just the man's presence, it was Clara's. She was different here, more vulnerable somehow, more open. Clayton had never seen her like this, never seen her share a moment of calm like this with anyone. There was no tension in her shoulders, no nervousness in her hands. She spoke softly, but Clayton could see the faint trace of a smile on her lips. It was the kind of smile she never showed him, the kind she reserved for someone else. Clayton's mind raced, his heart pounding in his chest. The image of Clara, the quiet, dutiful maid who worked so tirelessly on his ranch, was shattered before his eyes. She wasn't just the woman who scrubbed floors and cleaned dishes. She was someone with a life he hadn't even begun to understand. And as he watched her, his curiosity twisted into something more, something he couldn't quite name. The fear that had been growing in his chest turned to confusion, then to a deeper sense of betrayal. What was she hiding from him? Why had she never shared this side of herself? The sound of the door creaking closed broke him from his trance. Clara's figure disappeared inside the house, the door clicking shut behind her. Clayton stood there for a long moment, the weight of what he had just witnessed pressing down on him. He took a step back, his breath unsteady, and felt a sudden rush of guilt and uncertainty. What had he expected to find? What right did he have to pry into her life like this? Yet even as he asked himself these questions, he knew one thing for certain. This wasn't the last time he would follow her. Whatever was hidden in this corner of town, in Clara's life, was something he couldn't walk away from. Clayton remained frozen in place, his breath shallow, as he peered through the narrow gap in the door. The room was dim, the only light coming from a small lamp on the table, casting long shadows that danced across the worn wood floor. Clara sat at the table, her hands folded neatly in front of her, her posture calm, but there was something different about her tonight, something Clayton had never seen before. She was speaking with a man, his back to the door, but Clayton could see enough to know that this was no stranger. The way Clara spoke to him, the tenderness in her voice, was a revelation. It was the kind of softness Clayton had never expected to hear from her, the kind of intimacy he had never imagined she was capable of. The man was older, his hair thin and graying at the temples. His face was weathered, marked by the passage of time and hardship. He leaned forward slightly, listening to Clara with a quiet attention that made it clear this was no casual conversation. As Clara spoke, the warmth in her eyes, the small smile playing at the corners of her lips, made Clayton feel as if he were intruding on something sacred, something personal. For a moment, he almost regretted coming here, his chest tightening with a sense of guilt, but his curiosity kept him rooted to the spot, unable to tear himself away. The man reached out, placing his hand gently on Clara's. It was a simple gesture, but it spoke volumes. Clayton watched in stunned silence as Clara returned the touch, her fingers brushing against his with a kind of reverence that Clayton had never seen in her before. The connection between them was undeniable, and Clayton's mind struggled to process the scene in front of him. This was Clara, the woman who had worked tirelessly at his ranch for years, the woman who had always kept to herself, always distant and professional. But here, with this man, she was different. She was not just the maid, the silent worker who moved through life without making a ripple. She was someone's daughter, someone who had a past, a history that Clayton had never imagined. His thoughts raced, the pieces of the puzzle falling into place with painful clarity. This was her father, the man she had never mentioned in all the time she had worked for him. Clayton had assumed, all these years, that Clara had no family, no ties beyond her duties at the ranch. He had never thought to ask, never imagined there was anything more to her life than the work she did for him. But as he watched them, his chest constricted with the realization that Clara had a life outside of the rancha life that he knew nothing about. The shock of it hit him like a punch to the gut. He had spent years underestimating her, seeing only what he wanted to see, blind to the possibility that Clara, the woman who had been a constant in his life, was also someone with emotions, with history, with connections. Her father was here, in this rundown part of the village, in this humble house that Clayton had never known existed, and Clara had been hiding this part of her life from him all this time. The depth of her secrecy stunned him. Why hadn't she told him? Why had she kept her father, her past, hidden from him? And yet, as he watched them together, Clayton couldn't help but feel a deep sense of admiration for Clara. She had carried this burden alone for so long, maintaining the illusion of independence and strength while hiding the part of her that needed care, that needed connection. She had never asked for help, never let anyone see the vulnerability that now, through the crack in the door, Clayton was witnessing. The moment stretched on, and Clayton felt like an outsider in his own home. For the first time, he realized just how little he knew about the woman who had worked for him, about the life she had built beyond the walls of the ranch. His thoughts were clouded with questions, with confusion. How had he not seen this before? How had he missed the signs that Clara was more than the silent, dutiful maid who kept to herself? She was so much more than that, and Clayton, in his own narrow view of the world, had failed to see it. As the conversation continued inside, Clara's voice soft and low, Clayton could no longer bring himself to watch. The weight of the moment pressed down on him, and with a quiet sigh, he turned away from the door. His heart thudded in his chest, a mix of guilt, regret, and something else, a sense of loss. He had spent so many years thinking he understood everything about Clara, about her life, but now he realized he knew nothing at all. The realization was both humbling and unsettling, and as Clayton walked back toward the edge of the village, the quiet streets seemed to echo with the silence of his own misunderstanding. He had uncovered a side of Clara that he never could have imagined, and it left him with more questions than answers. Clayton returned to the ranch that night in a daze, his mind spinning in a whirlwind of confusion and disbelief. The long ride back from the village should have been a time for reflection, but instead, his thoughts were consumed with what he had just witnessed. Clara, his maid, the quiet, reserved woman who had worked for him without question, without hesitation, was hiding a life, a family, a connection that he never knew existed. And he couldn't shake the image of her sitting at that small table, her hands gently clasped in front of her, speaking to the man who was her father with a tenderness that shook him to his core. He had never seen Clara like that, not once in the years she had worked for him. Why had she kept this from him? The question gnawed at him relentlessly, each thought more consuming than the last. Clara had always been so professional, so detached. She had never shared anything about herself beyond the work she did. Clayton had never once thought to ask, assuming she simply preferred her privacy. But now, he couldn't understand why she had never mentioned her family, why she had kept such an important part of her life hidden from him. Especially when the man seemed to be in need, so clearly struggling in that rundown house at the edge of town. The questions flooded his mind as he wandered the ranch that night, his boots crunching over the gravel path. The cold night air did little to clear his head. All he could think about was Clara and her secrets. He had never been one to pry, but now he couldn't help himself. Every step he took, every task he tried to focus on, only seemed to bring him back to that small house at the edge of town. The image of Clara and her father lingered in his mind, replaying over and over again like a loop he couldn't escape. There was a bond between them, something deeper than mere family ties, and Clayton was struggling to understand why he had never been aware of it. For the next few days, Clayton found himself watching Clara more closely than ever. He paid attention to the smallest details, the way she moved, the way she interacted with him and others, the way her eyes seemed to carry a weight that hadn't been there before. He noticed the way she would sometimes glance at the door, as if expecting someone, or the way her posture would stiffen whenever the subject of family came up. It was as if she was guarding something, something precious that she had kept hidden from him. Every time she passed by him, a question seemed to hang in the air between them, unspoken but palpable. Why had she lied to him, or had she lied at all? Clayton wasn't sure anymore. All he knew was that something in her life had changed, something he didn't understand, and it troubled him in ways he couldn't explain. The ranch felt different now, quieter somehow, as if the walls themselves were holding secrets. Clayton's obsession with Clara's hidden life grew each day, his thoughts consumed with her. His questions became sharper, more insistent. What else had she kept from him? Was there more to her than the stoic maid who kept his home running smoothly? His mind raced with possibilities, each one more complicated than the last. Was it simply concern for her well-being, or was it something deeper, something more personal? Clayton had always prided himself on knowing the people around him, his employees, his friends, even his enemies, but Clara had eluded him. For all his years of experience in reading people, he had failed to see the truth about her. He had treated her like a fixture in his life, an object to be managed, and now he wondered if he had underestimated her entirely. There was more to her than he had ever realized, and it troubled him. What made matters worse was the realization that he didn't know whether he was simply worried about her or if his feelings had changed in a way he couldn't quite understand. The curiosity that had once been about finding out the truth now felt like something else, something deeper, something he hadn't expected. As the days passed, Clayton found himself questioning his own motives. Was he simply concerned for the woman who had worked for him for so long? Or was there something else at play, something he hadn't even realized was stirring inside him? The confusion was maddening, and Clayton felt as if he were chasing a shadow, one that slipped through his fingers every time he thought he had a grip on it. He couldn't stop thinking about Clara's life outside of the ranch, about the secrets she had kept from him, He was no longer sure if he wanted answers for her sake or for his own. Whatever it was consuming him, leaving him restless, anxious, and questioning everything he thought he knew about the woman who had worked so quietly by his side for so many years. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the ranch as Clayton stood on the porch, watching Clara finish her duties for the evening. The rhythmic sound of her broom against the floor echoed through the still air, the quiet of the ranch settling around them like a thick fog. Clayton's mind had been racing all day, the questions about Clara's hidden life gnawing at him relentlessly. He had spent enough time following her, enough time watching from the sidelines, and now he couldn't stand it anymore. He needed answers. His boots crunched softly on the gravel as he stepped toward her, the weight of the conversation he was about to have pressing heavily on his chest. Clara didn't seem to notice him at first, her head bent low as she swept the last of the dust from the porch. Clayton took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts, but when he spoke, his voice came out sharper than he intended. "Clara," he began, his tone a little more abrupt than he had planned. She froze for a moment, her broom coming to a halt, and slowly she turned toward him. There was no surprise in her eyes, no flicker of confusion, as if she had known this moment was coming all along. "Yes, Mr. Harrison?" she replied, her voice as composed as ever, but there was a subtle tension in the way she held herself, a stiffness in her shoulders that Clayton hadn't noticed before. It made something inside him tighten. He could tell she was waiting for him to continue, to ask whatever question had been brewing in his mind. But he hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to approach her. For so long he had seen her as nothing more than an employee, someone who followed orders without question. But now, seeing her in the context of her family, her life beyond the ranch, everything had changed. His perception of her had shifted, and with it, the way he saw their relationship. "Why didn't you ever mention your father?" Clayton asked, his voice softer now, but still laced with a mixture of curiosity and confusion. Clara's eyes lowered to the ground for a moment, her lips pressed together as if she were considering how to respond. The silence stretched between them, heavy and thick, before she finally spoke, her voice quieter than before. "I didn't want anyone to know," she said, her words barely above a whisper. "Especially you." The vulnerability in her voice surprised him, and Clayton's chest tightened in response. He had never heard her speak with such rawness, such honesty. It was a side of her he had never seen, a side he hadn't even known existed. Clayton stepped closer, his gaze never leaving her face. "Why?" he asked, the question tumbling out before he could stop it. "Why keep it hidden? You've been working here for years, Clara. I've never asked much of you, but I never knew. I never knew any of this." His voice faltered slightly, the weight of his own ignorance heavy on him. Clara took a slow breath, her gaze fixed on the ground as she seemed to gather her thoughts. When she finally looked up at him, her eyes were darker than usual, a storm of emotion swirling behind them. "My father. He's been ill for a long time now," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I've been taking care of him, doing everything I can to keep him going. But it's been hard, Mr. Harrison, so hard." She paused, as if trying to steady herself, but the vulnerability in her words only made Clayton feel more deeply the burden she had been carrying all these years. "I didn't want anyone to know," she continued, her voice quiet but steady. "I didn't want to burden anyone, especially you. You've always been kind to me, but I didn't think you needed to know about my struggles. I didn't want anyone to see me differently, to pity me." There was a faint tremor in her hands as she placed the broom down beside her body trembling ever so slightly. Clayton's heart ached as he watched her, the strength she had shown over the years suddenly feeling like a fragile thing. "I didn't ask for help," she whispered, almost to herself. "I didn't want to. I thought if I just kept going, kept working, maybe things would get better. But they haven't. And now I'm just tired." Her voice cracked at the end, and Clayton felt something shift inside him. For the first time, He saw her not as the composed maid who had worked tirelessly for him, but as a woman who had carried too much alone for far too long. She was so much more than the image he had built of her in his mind. Without thinking, Clayton stepped forward and placed a hand on her shoulder. The touch was gentle, but it sent a wave of warmth through both of them. Clara looked up at him, her eyes wide, her breath shallow as she searched his face for some sign of judgment, some indication that he saw her as weak. But there was no judgment in his gaze, only understanding, empathy. "You don't have to carry it alone anymore," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "You don't have to hide it, not from me, Clara, not ever again." For a moment, Clara's eyes welled with unshed tears, and Clayton watched as the walls she had so carefully built around herself seemed to crumble just a little. She nodded, the weight of her own emotions finally surfacing in a way she had never allowed before. "I never wanted to burden anyone," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You're not a burden," Clayton replied, his hand still resting on her shoulder. "You're not alone, Clara." And for the first time, Clara allowed herself to believe it. The night after their conversation, Clayton found himself unable to sleep. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, each one tangled with the last, as he lay in the stillness of his bed. Clara's confession echoed in his mind, her voice trembling as she shared the burden she had carried for so long. The weight of it hung over him, suffocating in its intensity. She had been hiding so much more than he had ever imagined. The simple image of Clara, as just the quiet maid who kept his house in order, was shattered, replaced by something deeper, something far more complicated. He couldn't stop thinking about it, the way she had looked at him when she spoke of her father, the vulnerability in her voice when she admitted how tired she was, how worn down by the years of caring for him. He had always assumed Clara was just a part of the background of his life, someone who did the work without asking for anything in return. But now, he realized how little he truly knew her. There was a whole life she had kept hidden from him, a life full of struggle, sacrifice, and quiet resilience. And in that moment, Clayton felt the first stirrings of guilt for never once having asked about her past, about what brought her to his doorstep in the first place. The more he thought about it, the more confused he became. Why had she kept it all to herself? Why had she hidden such an important part of her life from him? It didn't make sense. She had trusted him with so much, trusted him with her work, her loyalty, and her time, but she had never trusted him enough to share this. Was it because she feared his judgment? Or was it because, in her quiet strength, she had convinced herself that she had to handle everything alone? Clayton's respect for her deepened, no longer just for her hard work and dedication, but for the strength it took to carry such a heavy burden without ever complaining. He thought back to the countless nights she had stayed late, always the last to leave, never once asking for help, never once giving in to the exhaustion that must have surely weighed her down. Clara had shown him nothing but professionalism, nothing but quiet efficiency. It had never occurred to him that there was more to her than that, more to the woman who had worked tirelessly, without question, without hesitation, for years. And now, in the quiet of the night, as the wind howled outside, Clayton felt the walls around his own heart begin to crumble. He had always prided himself on being in control, on knowing the people around him, but Clara had proven that even the most familiar faces could hold untold stories. His assumptions about her had been shattered, and he didn't know how to process it. It made him feel as though he had been living in a world of his own making, blind to the reality of the people who had always been there, right under his nose. But there was another part of him that couldn't let go of the question. Why had she kept it hidden from him for so long? Why had she chosen to bear this alone when, clearly, she had trusted him with so much? Was it because she thought he wouldn't understand? Or did she simply not want to appear weak in his eyes, afraid of revealing the cracks in her armor? Clayton felt a deep sense of conflict stirring inside him. He was no longer sure how to see her. The woman he had known, the quiet, self-sufficient maid who had always been distant, professional, was now someone entirely different in his eyes. She was someone who had been carrying the weight of her world in silence, someone who had a heart and a soul that he had never truly seen until now. He thought about her father, the man she had cared for so tirelessly, and a pang of sympathy filled him. Clara had spent years shouldering that responsibility, never asking for help, never showing anyone the burden she was carrying. She had made herself invisible in a world that only saw her as a servant, a worker, someone who existed only to fulfill others' needs. But Clara had been more than that all along. She had been a daughter, a caregiver, a woman with her own struggles and dreams, and Clayton had been blind to it. The confusion and respect Clayton felt for her only deepened as he thought more about her. There was so much more to Clara than he had ever realized, and he couldn't help but wonder if there were still more secrets left to uncover. Was this the only part of her that she had kept hidden? Or were there other aspects of her life, other pieces of her heart, that she had locked away from the world? The thought of what he might not know about her, what he might still be missing, unsettled him in ways he couldn't explain. As the hours stretched on, Clayton realized that he couldn't keep living in the dark about Clara. He had to understand her, truly understand her, and not just as the woman who cleaned his house and cooked his meals. He had to know the truth, all of it, even if it meant facing the discomfort that came with discovering how little he had truly known her. But more than that, Clayton realized he wanted to know her. He wanted to see the woman behind the mask she had so carefully crafted. He wanted to be the one she no longer had to hide from. As the night wore on and the weight of his thoughts settled in his chest, Clayton knew one thing for certain: his relationship with Clara would never be the same. And for the first time, he was ready to confront that reality. Clayton sat at his desk late one evening, the papers before him forgotten as his thoughts drifted back to Clara. The quiet maid he had known for so many years had become a riddle he couldn't solve. He had never considered himself a man of feelings. His life had been about control over his ranch, control over his business, control over his relationships. He had prided himself on seeing things clearly, on knowing exactly where he stood in the world and with the people around him. But now, with the truth of Clara's hidden life laid bare before him, he realized how little he truly understood. The more he thought about her, the more complicated his feelings became. There was respect, certainly deep respect for the strength she had shown in carrying a burden so heavy, so long, without ever asking for help. But there was also guilt, a quiet shame he couldn't shake. He had treated Clara like a fixture in his life, something dependable and constant, a person who existed to serve him and his needs. Yet he hadn't even bothered to understand her life beyond the walls of the ranch. The realization made him uncomfortable, the weight of his own ignorance settling around him like a heavy fog. The discovery of Clara's struggles had made him question his position in the world. As a wealthy rancher, Clayton had always held power not just over the land he owned, but over the people who worked for him. He had grown accustomed to being in control, to making decisions that shaped the lives of others. He had thought of himself as a benevolent employer, fair and just. But now, as he sat there, the walls of his carefully constructed world began to crumble. He had never truly seen the people who worked for him, not in the way he should have. He had never taken the time to understand their struggles, their stories, their lives. In his mind, they were simply part of the machinery that kept his ranch running smoothly. And Clara, with her silent strength and dedication, had been one of the most visible parts of that machine. But now, with the truth of her life out in the open, Clayton realized that he had been living in a bubble, insulated from the reality of the world outside his gates. The distance between him and the people who worked for him, especially Clara, had always been there, but now it felt more pronounced than ever. He had assumed they were all separate from him, living lives that had nothing to do with him. But Clara's secret, her silent suffering, had exposed the cracks in that belief. He wasn't as separate from the lives of his employees as he had thought. He had been living in a world of his own making, blind to the realities of those around him. And now that he knew, now that he understood how little he had truly seen, he felt helpless. Clara had hidden so much from him, and while she had done so out of self-reliance, he now recognized how much of it had been because of his own ignorance. He had never once asked about her life beyond the ranch. He had never considered what she might be dealing with, what struggles she might have been carrying in silence. And now, as he sat in his study, it became clear to him that he had been just as blind to the world outside his own privilege as any wealthy man. The comfort of his position had kept him insulated from the hardships of others, and Clara's revelation had shattered that comfort in a way he hadn't expected. The emotional distance between him and Clara, once just a quiet undercurrent of their relationship, now seemed like an insurmountable chasm. She had kept her life separate from his, and for good reason. She had never asked for his help, never let him see the cracks in her armor. She had been strong, self-sufficient, and yet, now, Clayton realized how much of that had been a mask. The woman who had worked tirelessly for him had been carrying the weight of a sick father, of a life that demanded more from her than anyone should ever have to give. And yet, in the face of it all, she had remained composed, professional, and steadfast. Clayton couldn't help but admire her, but at the same time, he felt an uncomfortable sense of guilt. He had been too wrapped up in his own life, his own concerns, to notice the depth of her struggles. In the silence of his study, Clayton's mind raced with conflicting thoughts. He had always prided himself on being fair, on treating others with respect. But now, he saw how little he had truly understood. He had been blind to the very people who had helped make his life possible. And now that the truth about Clara was out in the open, he had no idea how to bridge the gap between them. The distance between them was not just physical, it was emotional, rooted in years of unspoken assumptions and unacknowledged truths. And as much as Clayton wanted to reach out, to offer help, to show Clara that he saw her as more than just his employee, he knew that it wouldn't be so simple. The walls that had always separated them would not come down overnight. Clayton leaned back in his chair, his mind still reeling with the weight of it all. His feelings for Clara were no longer just about respect or curiosity. They had become tangled with guilt, admiration, and a growing sense of responsibility. But he wasn't sure where to go from here. He had never known what it meant to truly connect with someone on this level, to share not just the surface of their life but the depths, the secrets that made them who they were. And now, as he sat in the quiet of his study, he realized how little he had understood about the people around him, especially the one person who had been by his side for so long. He was left wondering, could he break down the barriers that had kept them apart? Or would he forever be left to carry the burden of his own ignorance? The days following Clara's confession had been quiet ones, filled with unspoken tension between them. Clayton found himself more attentive to her, though neither of them had yet broached the subject of her family. He had come to realize how much he had underestimated her, and with that realization came an uncomfortable awareness of how little he had truly seen of her life. Clara had always kept herself distant, and that distance had never felt more pronounced than it did now. It wasn't long before he learned that Clara's father had fallen ill again, and this time it was worse. Clayton had heard from some of the other hands on the ranch that she had been missing more days, her face pale with worry, her steps slower as she moved through the tasks that had once come so easily to her. The ranch had always been a place of routine for Clara, a place where she worked quietly without complaint, but now there was a heaviness to her movements, a quiet burden that seemed to weigh her down. One evening, after a long day's work, Clayton watched her walk back to the house, her eyes fixed on the ground, her shoulders hunched under the invisible weight she had been carrying. It struck him then, more clearly than ever before, how much she had sacrificed. She was barely holding it together, and yet she still gave everything she had to her work, to the ranch, to the people around her. Clayton had seen enough. He knew she needed help, but he wasn't sure if she would ever ask for it. It seemed as though she had spent her life hiding her struggles from everyone, never letting anyone see the cracks. Clayton had always admired her strength, but now it felt like a burden too heavy for one person to bear alone. As Clara made her way to the barn that evening, Clayton stepped forward, his decision already made. His heart raced as he approached her, unsure of how she would react. But as he walked up to her, He could see the exhaustion in her eyes, the way her body seemed to sag under the weight of it all. She didn't look up at first, too focused on the task ahead of her, but when she did, Clayton could see the surprise in her eyes, the way her face softened in recognition of his presence. "Clara," he said gently, his voice steadier than he felt, "I know this has been a difficult time for you." Her expression faltered, and Clayton could see her holding back. She wasn't the kind of person to admit weakness, especially not to him. But Clayton knew what he had to say next was something that had been weighing on his own heart for days. "I want to help," he said, his words blunt, but sincere. "I've been thinking about this, and I know it's not easy for you, but I'd like to offer you some financial help. You don't need to worry about the ranch for a while. I want you to be able to focus on your father, without having to carry the burden of work on top of everything else." Clara froze, her expression shifting from surprise to something else, something that looked almost like disbelief. She opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out at first. Clayton could see the internal struggle in her eyes, the way she wanted to refuse, but wasn't sure how to articulate it. She had always prided herself on her independence, on never having to rely on anyone. The thought of accepting help, especially from him, was something she wasn't sure she could bear. She began, but the words caught in her throat. She looked away for a moment, her hands clasped tightly in front of her as if trying to steady herself. "I don't know if I can accept that," she said, her voice quieter now. "I've always taken care of myself, Mr. Harrison. I can't just let you do this for me." Clayton took a step closer, watching her with a tenderness he hadn't known he was capable of. He could see how much pride she had in her independence, how hard it was for her to admit that she needed help. But the weight of her exhaustion was impossible to ignore, and Clayton knew that if he didn't step in now, it would be too late. "You don't have to do it alone anymore, Clara," he said softly, his tone firm but kind. "I know it's hard to ask for help, but you've been carrying so much for so long. You've been strong for everyone else, but now, it's my turn to help you. Please, let me do this for you." There was a long pause between them, the night air thick with unsaid words. Clara's eyes were closed now, as if trying to gather the strength to make a decision she wasn't sure she was ready to face. Clayton held his breath, waiting for her to respond. He understood her hesitation. He knew how much it meant for her to maintain control, to do things on her own terms. But he also knew that sometimes people needed more than just strength to get by. They needed others to stand beside them. When Clara finally looked up at him, there was a softness in her eyes that Clayton hadn't seen before. The walls she had so carefully built around herself were slowly starting to crumble, and for the first time, Clayton realized that Clara wasn't just a woman who worked for him. She was someone who had been living a life of quiet sacrifice, someone who had been hiding the true depth of her strength. "All right," she said quietly, her voice trembling slightly. "I'll accept your help, but I promise you, I'll find a way to repay you for this." Clayton smiled, a sense of relief washing over him. "You don't have to repay me, Clara. This is just me doing what's right." And in that moment, they both knew something had shifted between them. There was an unspoken understanding, a recognition that they were both in need of a fresh start. Clara had carried the weight of her world for too long, and now Clayton would help carry it with her. For the first time in their lives, they both had a chance to build something new, something that wasn't just defined by the roles they had played, but by the people they had become. Clara had always been a woman of quiet strength, someone who carried her burdens with grace, never asking for help. But since Clayton had offered her financial support, a weight she hadn't realized she was carrying had slowly begun to lift. Her father's condition had worsened, and for the first time, she allowed herself to focus entirely on caring for him, without worrying about the ranch, without worrying about how she would make ends meet. Clayton's generosity had given her the space to care for her family in the way she always wanted, but never thought possible. Each day, as she sat by her father's side, Clara found herself reflecting on how much had changed. Her father, once so strong and full of life, had grown frail, his once sharp mind now clouded by the illness that had taken hold of him. But the tenderness she had always felt for him only deepened as she helped him with even the simplest tasks, brushing his hair, feeding him, just holding his hand. She was grateful for the moments they shared, even though the time was fleeting. And though her father's health was in decline, Clara's heart found solace in the thought that she was there for him, that she hadn't abandoned him as she had feared she would. Clayton's offer had given her more than just the ability to care for her father. It had given her the time to breathe, to slow down, and to see things in a new light. What had once felt like a quiet prison of isolation now felt like a chance to rebuild not just her father's life, but her own. As she spent more time on the ranch, the space where she had worked tirelessly for years, she began to notice things she had never allowed herself to see before. The ranch, though vast and beautiful, had always felt like a symbol of her own unrelenting effort. But now, with Clayton's help, it felt like a place of possibility. At first, Clayton had kept his distance, as he always did. He had been a man of few words, a rancher who kept his emotions closely guarded. But something had shifted in him too, ever since he had made the decision to help Clara. There was a tenderness in the way he looked at her now, a softness that had never been there before. He no longer treated her as just an employee, as someone who merely did her job. Clayton was beginning to see Clara for who she truly was, a woman who had been through so much and yet still carried herself with strength and dignity. As the days passed, their interactions began to change. It started with small gestures, a hand on her shoulder as she passed by, a shared smile after a long day of work. Clayton would ask about her father, genuinely concerned, and Clara found herself talking to him in a way she had never done before. There was an honesty in their conversations that hadn't existed when they were merely employer and employee. She began to see a different side of him, a side that was softer, more compassionate than she had ever imagined. One evening, as they sat together on the porch, the air heavy with the scent of blooming flowers, Clayton turned to her with a rare, open expression. "You know," he said, his voice quieter than usual, "I never really understood what it meant to struggle until I saw you, to carry the weight of everything on your own shoulders. You've been doing it all for so long, and I've been so blind to it. But now I see you, and I'm glad I can help." Clara was silent for a moment, her heart swelling with a mix of emotions she couldn't quite name. It wasn't just gratitude that she felt for Clayton, but something deeper, something that had begun to grow between them over the past few weeks. "I never wanted to ask for help," she replied, her voice soft, almost as if she were speaking a truth she had kept buried for a long time. "I've always thought I had to do it alone. But I realize now, maybe that's not the way forward. Maybe I can let others in." Clayton's gaze softened, and for the first time, she saw him not just as the rancher who had helped her, but as a man who was learning to open up, to let go of his own burdens. There was something fragile in that moment, a quiet understanding that passed between them without words. They both had been living lives of quiet isolation, carrying their own pain, their own struggles. But now, for the first time, they had allowed each other to see the truth that they were both in need of something more than what they had known. The work on the ranch began to take on new meaning for both of them. They started to rebuild together, not just the physical spaces that had long been neglected, but the emotional walls they had each built around themselves. Clayton would spend time with Clara, working side by side, fixing the barn, planting new crops, repairing the fences that had fallen into disrepair. Each day brought them closer, and the distance that had once felt so insurmountable between them seemed to shrink with each passing moment. It was clear to Clara now that Clayton was not the man he had once appeared to be. He had his own struggles, his own burdens, ones that had been hidden beneath his stoic exterior. But as they worked together, they both began to shed the old skins they had worn, revealing something raw and real beneath the surface. And with every task, with every shared moment, their bond deepened. As the weeks passed, Clara felt a sense of hope she hadn't felt in years. The future was still uncertain, her father's health still fragile, but for the first time, she wasn't facing it alone. She had Clayton by her side, and she began to realize that this connection between them, this partnership, could be the beginning of something neither of them had expected. Though the road ahead remained unclear, there was a new light between them, a light that promised that even in the face of uncertainty, they would face it together. And for the first time, Clara allowed herself to hope for more, not just for her father's recovery, but for a future where she and Clayton could begin anew, side by side.